Good morning, a guten Erev Shabbos. So, like everyone, we heard the news yesterday that Israel and Hamas signed on to the hostage deal, which was approved by the Security Cabinet, which is in the middle of a meeting now at the Israeli Cabinet into Shabbos, which they never do, in order to approve it, which will begin on Sunday, with hopefully the release of some of the hostages. And like much of the Jewish world, my emotions are in turmoil. Will 33 beloved hostages really come home? Our anticipation is fraught with fear. The risk of retreating from northern Gaza, what happens when we retreat and who comes in? The release of terrorists with blood-stained hands and the devastating suffering of those left behind. There's only 1/3 of the hostages that are still in Gaza. What about the rest? Even imagining our hostages' release feels precarious. To hope is to risk the heartbreak of despair. We don't know what will happen. But I was thinking about this a lot. Hope and despair are not the opposites, but really connected. They're born from the same belief that change is possible. I remember growing up in Crown Heights, and something that Rebbe spoke about very much. We're entering the book of Exodus now. And in the book of Exodus, we read about the story of the Jewish people in the worst of exiles, in the Nazi concentration camps of those days, suffering tremendously. We read the story of Moses meeting God at the burning bush, and eventually God sending him to cry out to Pharaoh and tell him, "Let my people go." But there's something that comes before the whole story of the 10 plagues. And sometimes we forget about it, or we don't realize its importance. It says that the Jews cried out to God, "Atao shavosam el Hashem." God listened and heard their voice, and he came down to help them. Think about the Jewish people in Egypt, living in a time of slavery. Egypt didn't just have Jews as slaves, but the entire Egypt was one of slave mentality. Think about the chances of someone even thinking to get out of that. The Jewish people had to have the courage to cry out to God. Sometimes you think that the crying out to God was just a prelude to the story. But the truth is that God only listened and came to take the Jewish people out of Egypt till they cried, till they did something, till they had hope that things must and will change. Hope that in the beginning led to despair. If you think about it, in the beginning, after God sent Moshe to Pharaoh, Pharaoh said, "Till now, I let you take the stones and build the pyramids, but now you're going to make the stones too." And the Jews came crying to Moses, "Leave us alone." Look what happened. And Moses goes back to God and says, "Why? Why did it get worse since I came?" So if you think about that cry that the Jewish people had and the hope, originally it was hope that led to despair. But then God listened and took them out of Egypt. Because ultimately, every single instance of God coming to the rescue of his people begun with the people coming to their own rescue, with them crying out, with them doing something, with them having hope and faith that in the darkest of times and moments, even in a place like Egypt, that no slave was able to run away from, that they would be able to be free. They cried out, and God listened. We find the same thing with Moses. In this week's Torah portion, we read, "Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe." After God meets Moses at the burning bush, God gets angry with Moses. And the Kotzker Rebbe, the famous Chassidic master, says, "Why does it say bim Moshe, in Moshe? It should have said on Moses." And the Kotzker Rebbe says something so remarkable, that God realized that the only way that Moses would be able to be the leader that would take the Jewish people out of Egypt was if the anger was burning within him, if there was a passion within Moses to say, how could this go on? I'm going to make something change. Only when Moses was burning with anger at the situation of such slavery and such tyranny and such murder and such hate and such suffering, only then did God realize that he was going to be the one to be able to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. Only after the Jews cried out did their voice reach God, and God sent Moses, and Moses went to Pharaoh to get them out. It's dark times, there's no question. Bloodthirsty criminals are celebrating. When they're let out, those terrorists who killed so many people, they'll be dancing in Gaza. The people who said that they were victims of genocide are now celebrating victory. The first time in history that people who claim to be victims of genocide should claim history. And here we are in trepidation, thinking about the Bibis kids, hoping against all odds, which we probably know that maybe they should be alive. We think about those who will stay in captivity. But it begins with us crying out to God, with us making the first move, to let my people go, to let the hostages go. And you think about the people who cried and held rallies and screamed and begged and pleaded. You know, I watch Ellen Stefanik, who's becoming the UN ambassador, American, non-Jew. Every single day since October 7th, she posts about the hostages. You think about Hirsch Golden's mother and father. You think about all those who didn't make it out. But we know that it begins with us crying, enough is enough. That we will have hope. Even though there might come despair, we will have hope that things could change and things will change. Because God is listening to our cry. Shabbat Shalom.